maybe make hybridity something very different. Perhaps something even more dangerous than simply racial hybridity. Because the hybridity of flesh and spirit, that's dangerous. That's dangerous.
And that's ultimately, Brian, what you're calling the Christians in the church to do, is to consider this hybridity of flesh and soul, that we're made of not just our own flesh, but the Holy Spirit within us.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. I think we have a question way back there.
Hey, my name's Ryan. I look forward to reading your book. You've made a lot of great theological points tonight, and I really appreciate it. I was thinking about the Hebraic story of the Tower of Babel, where kind of in line with what you're talking about with Jesus, how he disrupts a prideful humanity and a power-seeking humanity, and like in your terms, a humanity that's seeking purity, right? And how he confuses the language there in that story. And then I think about you discussing with Jesus how Jesus interrupts the people of his day, and how that points to how it points to the gospel, basically. And so what I was thinking is, can you unpack maybe the Christology of discipleship, but also our need for race and culture, based on God interrupting and that kind of idea that you've presented tonight?
I guess what I would say is, I'll answer with a question, and then I'll answer my own question. I guess the question is, what does Pentecost matter, right? Because in a lot of ways, Pentecost is the reversal of Babel, right? So the languages get divided in Babel, and then Pentecost, all of a sudden people can hear in their own language. But it's like with a twist, though, right? It's not one language, but now, what is Peter doing but speaking, empowered by the Holy Spirit? The Spirit being God inside of him, right? So now Peter's very body is this fusion of spirit and flesh. Not just our soul, but even more profound. Literally, God is in us. That should be really, really scary. And so what does Peter do? But Peter speaks a language and everyone can hear in their own tongue. And so what this does is it begins to kind of confuse, because on the one hand, God doesn't erase the particularity, right? He doesn't erase the race, erase the ethnicity, erase the kind of particulars of their life, their language, right? But at the same time, what does he do? But he gathers it up and uses it to declare the promises of the Jewish God. And so I guess the question for us is, in our discipleship, how do we, not erase race or lose anything, but the question is, how do these particularities get and kind of set a flame in the Spirit to sing God's song? And I think if we give up those things, not to culture or anything, but if we, in a sense, what are these particular aspects that I inhabit as a biracial person, as a person raised in New Jersey, who does Africana studies, who talks a certain way? How do those voices declare God's mercies? And what if we had a community of people who were all doing that in their own voices, and yet the world heard in their own tongues? It'd be amazing. So I think discipleship is the process of discerning what those gifts are. How are we using them rightly? How are we not using them? How are we trying to control them rather than give ourselves up to them? Because it really requires a lot of vulnerability, because as soon as we utter the word, then we don't have any control over it. We can't determine how it's heard, right? Because everyone heard in their own language. All we can do is offer it. And then what will happen is people will receive it in really surprising and interesting ways. And that's oftentimes the scariest part. Because we want to reproduce ourselves. We want to plant churches that look just like us. No offense.
No. Any more questions?
Hi, my name is Autumn. Dr. Bantom, I was wondering personally how writing this book, living in Durham, North Carolina, how you were experiencing living in that culture. How did that inform your book? if it did at all, and how was that personally? How did you experience that differently than Maryland, differently than here? Wondering about those things.
Oh, that's a great question. I think for me, growing up in North Carolina, I don't think I could have ever done this outside of North Carolina. In part because the South has become a really, really different place. But one thing that's really interesting about the South is that black folk and white folk know how to live all up inside each other's business. I mean, this is part of, they're used to a kind of this strange arrangement of intimacy, right? So white folk had black servants and slaves in the house and out of the house. So they understood how to police the boundaries, but in really tight spaces. And so there were very clear lines about this. So when I went to undergrad, in just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. And a girl and I were kind of starting to talk a little bit. This is a white girl. And she said, well, I just don't think we can talk anymore. And I was like, well, why? I was like, if I try to talk to you anymore, I'll never get a date with a white boy in the school ever again. So on the one hand, there's a kind of being together. On the other hand, there's really profoundly, really closely policed boundaries. And so the South also race as a kind of perpetual open wound. And so we're always talking about it. It's always in front of us. We're always looking for offense. We're always hoping for reconciliation. It's a very racially intense place. But what's really interesting, and so D.C. was it's a kind of this conglomeration, but what's really interesting to me is coming to Seattle. And Seattle is progressive, diverse. Everyone's, oh yeah, we're down with all kinds of people. And then I tried to find a house. And not so much. But then people don't talk about it. And it's not really raw. And it's not really raw because people are progressive. I'm liberal. I'm with people. It's all good. I love black people. It's not my fault they can't afford to buy a house in my neighborhood. So the South was really important for me. I got to figure out what I got to write here. It's kind of messing with stuff, but yeah.
Hi, my name is Jonna Lee, and I would consider myself multi-ethnic. And kind of hearing the language, some of the words we're different from you adding an extra layer of note to people of color, minorities, and then additionally being of multiple races or ethnicities. And I was thinking about just continuing to name something different from, wondering what that perpetuates, even as recent New York Times articles or different things are coming out about the rise of multiracial youth and unions and what that might mean. It kind of struck me just sitting here thinking I'm a pink and yellow zebra in this black and white zebra world, but there's more and more multicolored zebras all the time. And so kind of imagining how that changes the conversation too. And even just what are some of our motivations for being here tonight? I think I like what you're saying about the voices that we all bring. It seems like for some of us in more homogenous contexts or even countries, I'm wondering how can this conversation come up? Does it necessarily take the mulatto theology, the experience of being multi, bi, whatever it might be, to have this kind of all Christians are mulatto? What is there hope for those contexts that are going to be for a while probably homogenous, or does it take a mulatto infiltration of this is, hey, what's up, this, I'm here too, something about a note or recognition. And I think you mentioned just the voices, what you're imagining, but if you could maybe share more about your imagination for how this goes on. I know you were surprised that we showed up, but we did, and I want to continue to show up in all of our lives and what we do.
Thanks. That was a lot of questions.
Brian, before you answer that, there's a blue color Honda Odyssey blocking the towing lot, so if that can be moved quickly.
Okay, I'm going to try and answer all of them, but if I don't, let me know and I'll come back to it. So I think in a lot of ways the question of the multi